There was a period of time a few years ago that I took a break from following current events, and the reason, and I was actually pretty good at following current events and following the news and politics and so forth, but I took a break for some spiritual reasons, and I've only eased my way back. One of the things that I've discovered is that when I follow current events and when I follow the news, I tend to get pretty inwardly, engaged in that because I really want to contribute and make a positive difference. But I've also learned that really I can make a much better positive difference with the people who live in my house and the people who sit in these seats. And that if I spend a significant amount of time not doing that, then it probably is not terribly fruitful. However, I do pay attention, and although maybe not as much attention as you, I have to confess that I haven't watched any of the debates from either party because I've really thought that I could probably predict what anybody's going to say without watching those debates. Maybe you can too. You probably can. But one thing that I definitely have noticed in this time and this year, and it will continue as this year goes forward in this election year, is that, and this happens in other years as well, in other election years, but I think as much now as in any time in my lifetime, is that there's a great deal of energy, a great deal of zeal that many people have for this election that is coming up, and the primaries that are going now, and a great deal of personal investment, and a lot of that investment from many people is driven by fear of something. And I think the fear that many people have, I'm not saying everybody who cares about politics, I'm not saying everybody who follows it, I'm not saying everybody who makes a campaign contribution or whatever, but I think for many people there is truly a fear in our country that our republic is spiraling out of control. That our republic is spiraling out of control. And interestingly, people have different ways of dealing with that fear that our republic is spiraling out of control. Some people, and I confess that, it even surprises me, a few years ago, I never would imagine this to be true of me, but I confess that for me, part of the temptation of feeling like our republic is spiraling out of control is to try to ignore it, to try to, just kind of put the covers over my head and ignore it. For other people, however, some strongly favor a particular presidential candidate because of this. The thought being, because the republic is spiraling out of control, we really need to get this person elected to prevent that from happening. There are others who strongly oppose a candidate because of this. The thought being, our republic is spiraling out of control. And if this person gets elected, then it's definitely out of control. And so we have to mobilize whatever to stop this person from getting elected. And there are still others who see the entire field of candidates as evidence that our republic is spiraling out of control. Like, if this is the best we've got, we're in big trouble. And within that, though, it causes an intense, for some of us, I confess, myself included, sometimes, an intense feeling of fear, an intense feeling of disturbance. I remember I was in college during the Monica Lewinsky scandal in the Clinton administration. And I myself was not by any means a fan or a supporter of Bill Clinton, but during that period of time, during the impeachment process and the trial and all of that, there was such a feeling that I had of how things were proceeding, like things were falling apart, like no matter who is in charge and no matter what the policies were that people favored, there was or there ought to have been, in my idealistic 20-year-old mindset, something more stable underneath it, that there are certain lines that couldn't possibly get crossed, or certain fail-safes that would have to click at certain points. And I remember that there was one particular morning that I was so grieved by this. There was a psalm that touched me very, very deeply, and it's Psalm 11. And in Psalm 11, David, I believe, is dealing, as he does in many of his Psalms, of being attacked by his enemies. And there's a particular line in Psalm 11 where David says, how can you say to me, he says, the Lord is my refuge, how can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? Run away. How can you say to me, when the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And when it feels like the foundations are being destroyed, there's a feeling of powerlessness, like the bad guys are going to win, however you define who the bad guys are. The bad guys are going to win. And because the bad guys are going to win, there's no peace. There's no peace inside. And that happens at a personal level too, shrinking down from the nation, shrinking down from the world to your own personal life. There can be things that you experience in your workplace or in school or wherever you are that it feels like the bad guys are winning. The bad guys are winning. In the office politics, the bad guys are winning. In my community, the bad guys are winning. In my family, the bad guys are winning. In my body, the bad guys are winning. This feeling of powerlessness then, when the bad guys are winning and I want to fight the bad guys, but I can't. They have all the leverage and I don't. And that can feed in some people, a sort of chronic resentment at the unfairness of the world, at the unfairness of institutions, at the unfairness of bosses, at the unfairness of people, at the unfairness of whatever. This seething sort of, it shouldn't be this way, but it is, and I'm angry about it, and there's no avenue by which I can deal with this. Nobody wants to be a grumbler. Nobody wants to be a complainer. I don't think anybody wants to sign up like, yes, this is what I want to be known as. I want to be known as Debbie Downer. Nobody says that. But at the same time, nobody wants to be treated unjustly either. And when we are treated unjustly, or when injustice seems to be happening in our space where we live, in our habitat, in our environment, the hopelessness that can be in that can be stifling. The hopelessness of this is how it is and there's no way out. But there is hope, no matter what the injustice, in the story of the supreme injustice. The supreme injustice that's ever been committed is the condemnation and sentencing of Jesus Christ. That is the most unjust action, the most unjust episode in the history of humanity. The Son of God, the perfect one, the innocent one, the one through whom the world was created, the one in whose image humans were created, being sentenced to death by torture by those humans. Now, if you want to see injustice, that is injustice. If you want to see the bad guys winning, that's the bad guys winning. But in that story is enormous hope for anyone who is a victim of injustice or who fears evil winning. What the Bible is describing here in the story that we read is a political situation. And like most political situations, there are different agendas, competing agendas, and words have double meanings. We're going to see as we look through this text where different people are saying things that can be construed in different ways. We see a situation where there are competing factions that are trying to get leverage over one another, but the one person who seems to be driven around, who seems to be subject to circumstances beyond his control, Jesus, is the only one who really knows what's going on. In order to understand what's going on in this text, and I hope that you're going to see this story, which you might be familiar with, in a way that you've never seen it before today, with lenses that you've never seen it with, you've never used before, to understand the background of what's going on here and the dynamic of what's going on here. We need to understand a little bit more about the political situation in Judea. The Romans, when they went and conquered the entire Mediterranean world, had as their objective generally to set up government in these different provinces in such a way that it would conform to the best possible means that they could get tribute. Tribute was a tax. It was a tax laid on people on an individual basis, a head tax, and also laid on land, a property tax that would basically get sucked from the entire Mediterranean world to Rome for its glory and power. And so there were different ways that the Romans handled their conquered provinces. Sometimes they would conquer a kingdom, and that king who was there would be pretty compliant, and so they would just kind of let things operate the way things normally would in that kingdom as long as the money kept coming their way. Most of the time what they did was they set up provinces according to a particular model. They had their own model, their own structure, their own government that then they would impose on people. But there were certain situations where there would be a group of people or a setup that was exceptionally sensitive. Maybe the people were exceptionally sensitive themselves, were prone to rebel, were prone to revolt, or there were particular cultural sensitivities that made it impossible or impractical or undesirable to set up standard Roman government, standard Roman rule. Judea was one of those places. It was small. It was far smaller than the typical Roman province. But it was small, and it was governed in a peculiar sort of way. The Romans knew that the Jews had a very strong sense of their own specialness. They knew that the Jews believed that there was one God, the God who created everything, instead of there being many gods. They believed that that one God had chosen them out of all the peoples in the world to be his chosen special people. The Romans thought this was ridiculous, but were perfectly willing to allow the Jews to continue to think this, so long as there was peace and so long as the money kept flowing to Rome. And in Judea at that time, there was a governing council called the Sanhedrin. It was 71 people. They were aristocrats. Of those 71, there was a small but powerful group called the Sadducees that was heavily focused around families that were connected with the service in the temple as high priest. There were some other families as well, and there were other rulers as well who were part of this council, this governing council, that were largely driven by this party called the Pharisees. We run into them in the Bible a lot. I'm not going to talk a lot about the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but the important thing is that you have this governing council, and it would always be the high priest who also had the job of being the president of this council of 71. The high priest was chosen by whoever the military leader was. In fact, in the days of Herod, when he was king of this area, Herod the Great, he was the one who appointed who the high priest would be. When he died, his son Archelaus, who was governing that area, would appoint who the king would be. But then when the Romans took over directly, they would appoint who the high priest would be. And that would be the person who would be leading this council, and that council had the power to govern Judea. They were the local government right there. It was Jews governing Jews. And the Romans were willing to allow them to do it their way. Jews were very, very sensitive about idol worship. They did not want there to be any idols, any graven images whatsoever. And the Romans were very content not to allow there being any idols in the territory of Judea. In fact, Roman legions, or Roman military forces, they wouldn't carry flags like cloth banners. What they would carry is a standard on a pole that would have these different items like made in bronze or wood that were painted, that were affixed to this pole. And that would be, the guy at the head of the column of troops would be carrying that thing. They were used to having a picture of Caesar on their pole that they would lead around. But the Jews were so offended by there being an image of a person on that pole that the Romans were willing to allow their troops to move through Judea without carrying their flag, without carrying their standard, so as not to offend the Jews. Similarly, in every place that the Romans conquered, they expected that in the temples of the people that they conquered, that there would be a sacrifice every day to the spirit of Caesar, to worship him and to pray for him almost like as a god. They knew that this was offensive to the Jews, so they didn't require the Jews to do this. They just asked the Jews, while you're praying to your own God, make a sacrifice for Caesar every day, and the Jews were willing to comply with that. And so the Romans tried to be very sensitive and very gentle. But there were two problems for the Jews. One problem was that no matter how sensitive Rome was, no matter how willing Rome was to allow them to live according to their own customs and their own law, Rome was still in charge. And they knew that Rome could interrupt that anytime they wanted to. And they had a problem with this because they had the promises in the Bible that they themselves, as the Jews, were supposed to have a king. They were supposed to have a Messiah. They were supposed to have the prophesied Son of David who is going to be in charge. And in fact, all the nations of the world ought to be bowing down to them. Rome shouldn't be in charge of the world. Jerusalem should be in charge of the world. And so no matter how much local autonomy they had, they knew that they were not in the position that, according to the prophets, they were supposed to be in. The other problem that the Jews had is who Rome sent to govern Judea. Because imperial policy may have been very gentle toward the Jews, but they appointed rulers of the Jews who were not gentle at all, who were tactless, who were blundering, who were harsh, and who completely undid all of the sensitivity that Rome was trying to put into place. And that leads us to a man named Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was the governor in Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Pontius Pilate, we don't know much about him, but we know that he was a military man. We know that he was a military officer and a Roman. We know that the soldiers that he was commanding in Judea were made up of Gentiles who happened to live in Judea, Greek speakers who lived there. And we also know that Pontius Pilate was brutal and harsh and hated Jews. He was a mean and nasty character. For example, one time Pontius Pilate took money out of the temple treasury to build an aqueduct to Jerusalem because it needed water. Well, the Jews were up in arms about this, that he went and took money out of the temple treasury. So Pilate allowed them to come and to basically shout at him, to urge him to change his mind about this and to put the money back. But in doing so, he took some of his own soldiers, dressed them in plain clothes, and had them carry clubs underneath their cloaks to mix in with the crowd. When Pilate gave the signal, his soldiers took out the clubs and savagely bludgeoned the crowd that had come, killing some and injuring many. This was the sort of thing that Pilate did. And Pilate hated the Jews. He hated the fact that they thought that they were so supreme and so superior. And he looked for opportunities to stick it to them as much as he possibly could. And he especially hated the Sanhedrin, who were supposed to be governing there. And so there's a very, very intense conflict between them throughout this entire period of time. Pilate's official objective was to keep the tribute tax flowing to Rome and to prevent revolt. But Pilate's personal objective was to dominate the Sanhedrin and to grind the Jews' faces in Rome's supremacy and their inferiority. And these two objectives sometimes clashed. The Sanhedrin were afraid of Jesus. They were afraid of Jesus because of what he might do in this conflict between them and Pilate. We read in John chapter 11, verses 47 and 48, "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." They believed that if all the people continued to believe that Jesus was Messiah, they would eventually revolt. And when they revolted, Pilate would call on legions from Syria to come down and crush the Jewish people, destroy the temple, eliminate the Sanhedrin from being in the position of authority, and scatter the Jews far and wide. As a matter of fact, their fears were well-founded in that, not related to Jesus, Jews in fact did this in AD 68, and it resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But however, here, earlier on, they were afraid that Jesus was going to be that person. And they were afraid of this. And so their thought was, we need to sacrifice Jesus now. We need to get rid of him now before there's a revolt and we lose everything. And so that's what's motivating the Sanhedrin, or a big part of what's motivating them to arrest Jesus, to get him away from his followers, and to deliver him up to Pilate so that Pilate would execute him. The reason is that the Sanhedrin, even though they had so much autonomy and so much independence as to how they governed, one thing they were not allowed to do was execute capital punishment. Only the Romans were allowed to do that. So they needed to get Pilate's cooperation, the cooperation of this guy who hated them. And so that's the situation here as we enter into this text, as the Jews take Jesus from the high priest. Caiaphas is the high priest. They take it says, to the palace of the Roman governor. That's a mistranslation there. It's the praetorium, and that was basically the headquarters of wherever the guy in charge happened to be at the time. Pilate's headquarters, his permanent headquarters, was Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean Sea, but he would come up to Jerusalem when there were lots of people there to keep order. So his temporary headquarters was in Fortress Antonia that was right next to the temple, and that's where they took him. And so they were there, and Pilate comes out and talks to them, and he says, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" And they're coy. They say, "Well, if he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." We actually read in other texts, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they were bringing accusation against him. They were saying that he's telling people not to pay their taxes, because they know that Pilate's job is to keep the tax going. He said he's telling people not to pay their taxes, even though Jesus actually said exactly the opposite of that. And that he goes far and wide, and people think that he's the Messiah, a king. Right? So a rival to Caesar, that's why you need to get rid of him. So Pilate says, So Pilate's confronted with this situation. He's got to figure out, is Jesus really a threat and dangerous? Because if he is, I need to kill him. But if he's not, boy, this would be a great opportunity to stick it to the Sanhedrin again. We actually find out in one of the other Gospels that Pilate knew that it was, and I quote, because of envy that they delivered him up to them. So Pilate knew, he had been around, he had been watching what was going on. He knew that a lot of people were following Jesus. He knew that Jesus had been criticizing the chief priests. He knew that the chief priests didn't like it. And so if he could keep Jesus alive, to keep criticizing the chief priests, and to keep making them look bad, Pilate was very happy to do this. So he's now trying to sort out, do I have to kill him, or can I keep him alive just to stick it to the chief priests a little bit longer? So he has Jesus come in, and he starts to talk to him. And he says, okay, so what's the deal, Jesus? He says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, is that your idea, or did others talk to you about me? You know, Jesus is not very cooperative. He's somewhat cooperative, but he's actually somewhat restrained himself. Pilate says, what, am I a Jew? It's your people who hand you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus says something very interesting. He says in verse 36, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would be fighting. But because they're not, you know that my kingdom is not from here. Interesting statement. My kingdom is not of this world. I am a king. But it's not the kind of kingdom you're used to. It's not the kind of kingdom that Caesar reigns over. It's not the kind of kingdom that my people used to have before you guys came. It's neither of those. It's a completely different sort of a thing. So Pilate says, oh, okay, so you are a king then. And here again we have a mistranslation in the old NIV. I think as the NIV has been updated, they changed this. In the version that I'm reading from here, and that's in your seats, it says, you are right in saying I am a king. That's not actually what it says. What it actually says is, Jesus actually says, you say I am. So he's not really coming forthright. He just, okay, you said it. Those are your words, not mine. But let me tell you, the reason that I've come is to testify to the truth. That's why I'm here. I'm here to tell the truth. And everybody who knows the truth, who cares about the truth, listens to me. And Pilate says one of the most interesting questions in all of the Bible. What is truth? And lots of people have wondered through the centuries, what did Pilate mean when he said, what is truth? What is he asking about? Does he really want to know? Is it a philosophical question? It's hard to say. I think what he's saying is he's basically saying, this is politics. What does truth have to do with it? This is not about truth. What we're doing here is not about truth. It's about power. It's about I win, they lose, or they win, I lose. Truth has nothing to do with whether you're going to live or die. What difference does the truth make? But whatever Pilate concludes, he concludes that this guy is not really a threat. He concludes that this guy is not the typical kind of rabble-rouser, not the typical kind of insurrectionist. So he goes back out to them and he says, this guy's harmless, I'm letting him go. And they say, no, don't let him go. give us Barabbas. See, there was a custom that we find out here as we go through the text, that during this time, during the Passover, Pilate would to kind of pacify the people, he would take one guy that he had in prison and let him go free. Okay? And they say, no, we want Barabbas to go free. So Pilate says, okay, they're going to make it hard for me. They're not just going to let him go. All right, well, maybe if I beat him really bad, then maybe I'll let him go. Notice that Pilate thinks he's innocent, but Pilate has no problem with flogging a person within an inch of his life without trial or without any conviction. This is not a problem for Pilate. He doesn't care, okay? If you've ever seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, you cannot forget the flogging scene. It's like the worst part of the whole movie to watch. It's absolutely unbearable. I mean, it was just this savage, cat of nine tails with these, rocks and glass embedded in the leather straps that grabbed into somebody and ripped their flesh off. And Jesus was savagely beaten, savagely flogged. And then the soldiers think that this is hilarious, so they put a robe on him and weave a crown of thorns and shove it over his head, and they put a staff in his hand, and they bow down, oh, hail, King of the Jews! They just think this is a riot. Yeah, this guy's the King of the Jews, sure. Yeah, the Jews want a king. Of course the Jews want a king. Like they could possibly do anything to resist Rome. Hail, King of the Jews, smack! Beat him over the head with his scepter. And so then they take him back to Pilate, and Pilate looks at him and probably thinks he's hilarious also. This is great. I'm going to show the Jews what I think of their king. Goes back out to the high priest and says, here's your king. Here he is. This is what we at Rome think about a Jewish king. This is what we'll do with any of your kings. Here you go. You can have him back. No, we want Barabbas. Why? What has this guy done? Tell me what this guy has done. Why should I kill him? And then there's an interesting back and forth. They say, no, we don't want him. He says, in fact, this guy has made himself out to be the Son of God. And then we read something interesting in verse 8. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Now, we didn't get any indication before this that Pilate was afraid. But he takes Jesus back inside, and he starts asking him questions. Where do you come from? And Jesus doesn't answer him. Don't you realize I have the power to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Pilate, we're trying to figure out what is Pilate thinking here. It's hard to say. I mean, Pilate is a brute. He's a nasty, violent man. He has no interest in justice. He has no interest in caring for Jesus' rights. But at the same time, as the day has gone on, he's looking at Jesus and he's thinking, this guy is not like anybody else I've ever encountered before. I mean, everybody else who comes to me, they tell me why they're innocent. They tell me why I shouldn't be killing them. They plead for their life. They'll say anything to make the pain stop. This guy just comes in, doesn't answer my questions, talks in riddles, doesn't seem to care whether I kill him or not, acts like he's the one in charge. And he calls himself the Son of God. Maybe there's a moment that for this profane man, he actually thought, what if this guy's telling the truth? What if this is for real? But when Jesus says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above, Jesus is talking about his Father in heaven. But when Pilate thinks about the power that's given to him from above, he's thinking of Caesar Tiberius. And he's thinking about the person that he has to report to. And he's thinking about the fact that if I kill this man and he really has this many followers who think he's God, there will be a revolt and I will lose my job. But if I do not kill this man and he has followers who thinks he's God, they might revolt and I'm going to lose my job. But either way, Caesar is going to have my hide based on this situation. What do? Do I kill him? Do I not kill him? What's going to keep the peace? What's going to prevent revolt? He goes back out to the people and he says one more time, really, he's done nothing wrong, let him go. But he says something interesting. He says, here is your king. They say, take him away. He says, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answer, we have no king but Caesar. Got him. I got him to admit in public that Caesar is their Lord, that Caesar is their king, that they are loyal, that they will be allegiant. And I finally got them. I got one over on them. I forced them in public to demonstrate we're in charge and they're not. That's good enough for me. Let's call it a day. Wash off my hands. Send Jesus to be crucified. And in the middle of all of this, it looks like Jesus is a pawn in a political game. Pawn of these unjust people. Sentenced and crucified without being convicted of a crime. And yet Jesus was in charge the whole time. Because Jesus really is the king. He really is the king of a new government that's replacing the unjust governments of this world. He really is a king, but not from this place. And people who love the truth, who is Jesus himself, have a share in that kingdom. It's a kingdom that's coming. See, earthly powers do as they will, but God is in charge. Earthly powers will do what they want to do, but God is the one that's in control. And God is so in control that God uses every injustice to set up ultimate justice for those who are his. Jesus rules. Jesus rules, and he rules so powerfully that all of the bad things that go on in the world, all of the evil things, all of the bad guys winning is actually a part of what Jesus uses for the good guys, for God to win in the end. Jesus rules. Jesus is the one who's really in charge. And in the unjust things in your life, and the unjust things in our nation, and the unjust things in this world, when it looks like the bad guys are winning and the foundations are crumbling, and what can the righteous do? It is all a part of the plan. It's all a part of the timeline. It's all a part of the program that God is going to use to bring about justice when Jesus comes back. This is for real, folks. This is going to happen. And there are ways that you can show your confidence now that Jesus rules when you're a victim of injustice. You can follow Jesus' lead. When you're a victim of injustice, you can follow his lead. You can follow his example, trusting that he is the way into a new regime. That if you trust and obey him at your own risk, that you're going to have a stake in what is coming. That when Jesus returns again from heaven, where he went after he rose from the dead, that you're going to be with him and reigning and ruling over this world, and judging this world at his side rather than being under judgment when he comes. You can follow his lead. It says that Jesus, when he was slandered, when he was reviled, when he was insulted, said nothing. He took it. He endured it, knowing that God would justify him, that God would vindicate him, that God would validate him someday. You can expect God to give you the words to say when you need to say something. Jesus actually said to his disciples, look, they're going to haul you before the authorities. You're going to get hauled before the authorities for my sake, for the sake of my name, for the sake of my gospel, and they're going to demand things of you. They're going to ask you questions. But I'm telling you right now, don't even bother trying to prepare what you're going to say, because the Spirit of your Father is going to speak through you in that moment. He's going to put words in your mouth, and you're going to know exactly what to say when you need to say it. Let me tell you, folks, I have experienced that before. Not before earthly kings and governors, but times where I've gone before people that I knew had an accusation against me, and I had no idea what to say, and the Lord has just given me in that moment exactly the right thing to say. He does that. Remember that Jesus is unique in that he was without sin. Jesus, in that situation, had the confidence to just sit and take the accusation knowing it was totally false. Frankly, we're sinners. And when we're in a situation that's unjust and where we're accused of something or where something is going bad, chances are we contributed to it somehow. I know, probably not for you. You're the exception. But otherwise, the rest of us, we've probably contributed to that situation somehow. It might be a small thing we've contributed. One thing that I learned from some wise people a long time is that if I am hurt, if I am traumatized, if I am attacked, maybe the only thing that I'm contributing to the situation is my resentment. Maybe it really was all their fault, but if I'm resentful, if I can't forgive, that is my contribution to the situation that needs to be undone. And most of the time, there's something else I can look at what I've done. I could say, well, when I chose to do A, I had totally good intentions, and I didn't know any better. But if I could go back over again, I would do B, and that would be different. Be humble enough in those times that it appears you're being treated unjustly to honestly look at yourself and say, what have my actions contributed to this situation? Fourth, if you're afraid of loss, if you're afraid that everything you know and love is going to be taken away, that you're going to lose your job or you're going to lose your country as you know it, you're going to lose your safety, take inventory. Take inventory of your life. What are you afraid of losing? And also ask yourself, what can you never lose? And which matters to you more? The stuff that you can lose or the stuff that you can't? Your money you can lose. Your house you can lose. Your community you can lose. Your family you can lose. But eternal life and the smile of God and His love and grace and redemption, you can never lose that. Which matters to you more? Be honest about it. And if the stuff you can lose matters more to you than the stuff you can't lose, then go to God and ask God, God, deliver me from the stuff that I feel like I can't lose. Deliver me from the stuff that I'm afraid of losing so that I'm free enough to let it go. And finally, if you're afraid of exclusion or being despised, if you're afraid of being an outcast, if you're afraid of being labeled with an X, if you're afraid of everybody laughing at you, of everybody excluding you, of everybody treating you like dirt, lean harder on the one who accepts you. Song by a Christian band from 30 years ago, DeGarmo and Key, they had a song that the chorus said, I'm accepted, I'm accepted, I'm accepted by the one who matters most. Lean hard on your acceptance by the one who matters the most. You have a Father in heaven if you have had faith in the Son of God. You have a family that lasts forever and that you'll never lose. Jesus rules. Jesus rules. So don't live by what you can see. Don't judge, don't assess, don't evaluate your situation based on the injustice that you see in this world that's either present or that is coming. Instead, walk by faith. Walk by faith that Jesus rules and the injustices are going to produce the ultimate righteousness that you have a stake in, if and only if you've placed your whole self in His hands.